Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming, and thanks again to the architects for the very interesting projects presented. I want to acknowledge and welcome Dame Shirley Porter for joining us, the visionary behind, or rather in front of the Porter School of Environmental Studies and the new building that most of you saw in the tour today. Dame Shirley, I can tell you that we've had quite a few comments of people going on the tour before this event and a previous workshop we had today. People didn't want to leave the tour and get back into session, so it was a big success, I think, so far. And perhaps our distinguished guest will also have something to say about that, because he had a tour of the building yesterday. So it is now my duty and great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. He'll be speaking after quite intense 2 days. We've put him to work since we brought him here. Professor David W. Orr is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics and Senior Advisor to the President of Oberlin College in Ohio in the United States. He's the author of 7 books, including the most recent Hope is an Imperative, which he spoke about yesterday at the Porter School seminar, and Down to the Wire, Confronting Climate Collapse. He's also the co-editor of 3 other books. He has authored nearly 200 articles, reviews, book chapters, and professional publications. He's the founding editor of the journal Solutions, which I think we're all looking for. His work became a cornerstone in the development of environmental education and the environmental movement over the last 3 decades through promoting of key concepts that have become commonplace since, such as ecological literacy, place and pedagogy, and ecological design. His writings challenge assumptions at the core of the educational, scientific, and political crisis of our times. Crises, I guess. Professor Orr's prominence is probably most recognized with heading the effort to design, fund, and build the Adam Joseph Lewis Center at Oberlin College, which was named in 2010 as the most important green building of the past 30 years, and one of the 30 milestone buildings of the 20th century by the U.S. Department of Energy. And perhaps most important of all these was, as Arya has mentioned several times, the inspiration to the new Porter building. It's a personal statement, I know, but still. The Lewis Center has grown into a model known as the Oberlin Project, embracing what Orr terms wide spectrum sustainability of the entire town and surroundings, and I'm sure he'll tell us about the development into even the larger area and how there's a really greater development from this one building into great impacts on whole areas. David Orr is the executive director of the Oberlin Project, and he will tell us more about it. Thank you so very much for coming.
You sit okay? It's a real pleasure to be here, and this is kind of an endurance test. We're in our, 3rd hour of the afternoon. Dave Shirley Porter, it's a pleasure to see you again, and thanks for the support of the Porter School, which I'll say in a moment just a bit more about. And Sagi, thank you for letting me know what's going on here. My Hebrew is not so good. Neither some people think is my English, but that's a whole other matter. And we don't have controversies in the States like this one about green building. We just shoot each other. So it's a pleasure to be back here at Tel Aviv University. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat short, but I want to place things in a context. And first of all, an admission, I'm not an architect. I'm more a troublemaker than I am an architect, but I have good friends who are architects. And I've learned a great deal in the past 10 or 15 or 20 years about architecture and so forth. So on the screen here is a black swan. And it refers to, it's one way to capsulize our world. It refers to a book by a risk analyst by the name of Nicholas Taleb. And Taleb is famous for having foreseen a good bit of the economic crisis, the banking collapse in 2008. He's later written a book called Anti-Fragile, but that's another thing. The point of his book is that all swans are white until one's black. Now, Taleb did not know when he wrote the book that there is a population of black swans in Australia, but that's a whole other matter. But the point of the book is, remember statistics, remember that bell-shaped curve, Gaussian curve? You've all had statistics, I presume, right? You have, my students call it, if you pick up the difference in the language, sadistics, as in sadism. But anyway, the bell-shaped curve, and Taleb was concerned not about what happens under the large part of the curve, but this part out here, which is called, in statistics, the long tail. And the point of the long tail is that we don't know what the probability of various things may be. But think Fukushima. Probably nobody really estimated the risks much before the Fukushima disaster, but a Richter 9 event, earthquake, tsunami, bad equipment made by General Electric, an American corporation, probably a lot of political corruption, and the rest is history, black swan event. And no one really knew what that long tail probability was. But there is now radioactivity evident in measurable amounts on the west coast of the United States from Fukushima. It will spread worldwide. Chernobyl, the collapse of the banks in 2008, the collapse of a bridge in Minneapolis crossing the Mississippi, which had been inspected 2 weeks before. Black swan events are events of unknown probability or presumed low probability, but no one knows for sure about these things. And then the effects are global. They ripple around, like throwing a stone into a pond, the ripples go out, and they're permanent. And so once a black swan event occurs, and it can be technological, but also can be political. Think of the Arab Spring. The price of food goes up, then unrest happens, and then things fall apart politically. So black swan events. And Taleb, let me get to the point of this slide. Taleb ends the paperback version of the book with a design challenge to all of you who are architects, urban planners, technologists, and really to all of us, to build a society that is robust to error. And in the parlance, said differently, this is a society that is resilient. When you make a bridge or you make a building, there's some flex to it. It's not a hard structure. It can bend in the wind. It shifts with change in temperature and so forth. But that's not how we've built a society. We live in a society that is tightly connected, this global economy. And so we are increasingly vulnerable to black swan events. That is a challenge to architects, engineers, urban planners, economists, and people who shape the world in which we live. And among those challenges, this, I think, is going to be the worst. And this is, all of you know about climate change, and I would argue that the words climate change don't really quite capture the essence of it. It isn't so much climate change, which, or global warming, which, where I'm from in Ohio, back in the USA, global warming sounded really good this winter. We had an awfully cold winter. But if you looked at it over a period of 120 years, it was only the 42nd coldest winter over 120 years. There's this phenomenon of shifting baselines. We get used to things when they change. And so warmer temperatures, well, that's the norm. And many of you young people are now used to a world that, or to climate and weather that your grandparents never knew. And so what David Archer is saying in this slide is that once carbon is in the atmosphere, it stays there a long time. So when you think of solving problems, if you have a problem with a building, that's solvable. You move this around, you change the shape and geometry of it, and you can solve that. But climate change is different. Once you put carbon in the atmosphere, it stays there for a long time, thousands of years. And so by the time carbon weathers out of the atmosphere, Maybe 1,000 years or 10,000 years will have passed. David Archer says that the carbon that I released flying from Cleveland, Ohio to Tel Aviv a couple of days ago, a quarter of that, give or take, will still be in the atmosphere 10,000 years from now. Do you follow what I'm saying? We've crossed a line, and we have purchased an economy, bought an economy, probably a climate that is one we aren't going to like very much, and it is essentially permanent. What this means in practical terms is warmer temperatures, longer droughts, rising sea levels, more social conflict as things come undone. So as water wars, which have plagued us in the past, become more severe, count on more turmoil and more economic turmoil. So all the buildings that you design as architects and I work on differently, all those buildings have to meet a different test. This is a black swan world. And so the changes in that world will be rather sizable. So count on stronger winds and wind shear. We're now doing a hotel, and I'll show you in just a moment, I think the first entirely solar-powered hotel, that will have to meet standards for which we have no standard. They'll have to meet standards for wind shear, so glass buildings will be much more vulnerable. Longer droughts, larger rain events, and so you can see this statistically beginning to occur. The numbers on big rain events around the world are really quite striking. Increased lightning and so forth. So it isn't global warming. It is really planetary destabilization. Because once you change the thermostat of Earth, which we have done and are continuing to do, then everything else changes over here. This is a tightly interconnected system. And so all of you know that. That's just kind of background. And then buildings. Winston Churchill, who, by the way, the picture of Churchill up here was, I was told by a photographer, that scowl, that famous scowl occurred when the photographer was ready to take his picture in World War II in about 1942 in Toronto, Canada. And he grabbed the cigar out of Churchill's mouth and snapped the picture. So this is, he's not thinking of Adolf Hitler here. He's thinking, I just lost my, my cigar. And, but Churchill said, we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us. And so before I start, I want to make clear that buildings are means, not ends. They are simply future ruins. They will collapse. Entropy will make sure of that. So the building that architects turn over to a client on day one, it looks beautiful, the paint, it looks shiny and so forth. Give it 50 years. Give it 100 years. Give it 500 years. It'll be a ruin. That's what buildings do, unless they're rescued by tourism. And some buildings get rescued by tourism, so we keep them propped up and shiny and so forth. But buildings are means, not ends. And so then the question comes back is, what is the means for this building? What's it do in the world? What happens in the world because of a particular building? Secondly, they ought to manifest big ideas. Buildings shouldn't be about trivial things. Not now. Not in this black swan world. Not in a world that is rapidly changing, coming apart somewhat at the seams. We've got to step up to a degree of nobility and foresight as a human species if we want to be here. This is a test of whether we in fact are Homo sapiens or not. Third, these buildings are integrated into larger systems. So the point of the talk, and when I get to this, I'm going to describe the Oberlin project in our attempt to see a larger pattern around buildings. But they're integrated in larger systems, and they're social systems, they're economic systems, they're ecological systems, they're climate systems, they're also security systems. And so it isn't enough to focus just on a building or the immediate surrounding landscape. That is part of a larger system. And then they are something, and I'll explain this in just a moment, they are somewhat part of an education of citizens, of what your obligation is in the world, what we do in the world, what do we do together. In the States, we suffer partly because of kind of individualism on steroids. I hope that translates. It's just hyper-individualism. And Thomas Jefferson bequeathed that to us. And we bear that burden of thinking about I, me, mine, and very seldom about ours and we and future. And then the last item here is organizational learning. And this is a tough one. In a previous section today, I don't know, can you see the bottom of the screen here? the bottom line here is organizational learning, and that's the toughest thing of all. If you say to an architect, design me a great building, make it look good, make it powered by sunshine, make it the kind of building people come together and they love and so forth, a building gets real affection, that's doable. You give them enough money and enough time, all of you architects know how to do this. It's just the client, if the client gives you enough support and so forth, you can do it. And these are great projects up here, by the way, thanks for that. But if you ask a prior question, how do you design an organization for which ecological design, good architecture, is the default setting? Do you follow what I'm saying? Does that translate? All right. How do you design organizations that in fact learn? Relative, not to market share or whatever, but to the way the world works as a physical system. Now, let me detour here. Academic architecture. This is a Frank Gehry building. How many of you architects like Frank Gehry's work? It looked like something bad happened at the metal factory. This is a U.S. building on a University of California campus, and I've asked people when I've shown this, what do you think happens in that building? And no one has a clue. The building doesn't announce anything. It's very small windows. These are all little windows here, little tiny windows here. It's aerodynamically designed. And so the answers come back, well, it must be an administration building. And it's aerodynamically designed so that they can get out of there quick and just blast off and go administer somewhere else. This is an academic building in Mexico. It was designed by a badly divided faculty committee. And then I don't want to leave my own campus out. This is a dormitory on my own home campus at Oberlin College in Ohio. Now, guess what this is? If you understand what I'm saying, who do you think, or what do you think the architects that designed that building designed for a living? Most of the time, they designed what? Fill in the blank. Any ideas? Say what?
Jails.
Exactly. They designed prisons for the state of Ohio. And so we had them design a dormitory. This is where we want people to flourish and think big thoughts. And we put them in a prison-like building. This is our library. And I don't know if you have seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You know that movie? There's a giant spaceship that comes down. This is our library. There's a giant spaceship that comes down, and a ramp flops out, and people go up into the mothership on the ramp. You remember that scene? Well, this is what that looks like at night. This is just like a giant spaceship, and students are ingested by knowledge, and then a little later regurgitated by knowledge, and so forth. This is a chemistry building. This is at Tulane University in New Orleans, and there's only one real good answer to this, and that is this. Take it down. Academic architecture has been not in the past in the States distinguished by, it's been more brutalist than it has been anything else. So that's the start of it. The importance of it is that buildings, and academic buildings included, are a big part of what ails us. So roughly a third of carbon emissions are related to buildings and the way we build. It's a larger number if you look at how people come to the buildings. So if you drive cars into asphalt parking lots and so forth. But they're a big part of what ails the world. Now, this was yesterday. I love this building, by the way. This is great. And I like it for a couple of reasons. First of all, the people that did it are nice people, and they're doing good things. Secondly, they took everything that we did on the Lewis Center, which is a very small little pebble that started maybe some things. They took that to a much different level. This is a, 30,000 square foot building roughly. So a little bit more than twice the size of the Lewis Center you'll see in just a moment. And then they put it on a hill. They put it, as Ariel was saying to me, they put it on a hill outside the boundary of the campus. I love this. We're open. I love the glass, I love the technology. I like the way the south face is open to businesses coming in. And so for technology display, and it's an open invitation to engage the technology community, which I think is an incredibly good idea. And then I like the way the pod on the outside, the south side, communicates to some 30,000 people that drive past every day. That's a building that stands on a hill and announces itself. I like the raw courage that it took to build this, and so I like that. And that now sets a different benchmark for design in academic campuses and for leadership in architecture. Now, let me make a distinction and we'll get down to work. Design is just how you make things. Ecological design is how you make things that fit. And fit in an historical context, cultural context, ecological context, and also climate context. So the Lewis Center, background on this. This is a building that we built on my campus in Oberlin, Ohio. We started this in 1995, put together a design team, and it became by default my project. So the college said, you can build your building, but we won't give you any money to do it. And so I used to joke that that left me only the Columbia drug cartel to raise money from. But then the college said, no, we'll take money from the drug cartel. You go find someone else. So anyway, we did it. And the way we started this was to put together a design team. The members here are on the screen. We had people from NASA, about probably in total 20, 24 people worked on the building. And one of the requirements was that they had to work with Oberlin students. So they weren't free to work on their own. And so the design charrettes that we had initially in the fall of 1995, 13 design charrettes. Every Saturday we had a meeting, and we bring in various kind of architects and so forth and talk with them. And what began to emerge from this conversation were a set of principles that had been adopted by the Hanover World's Fair sometime before, but they're well known to everybody in the green design field. And the ones that are particularly tough is nature is the standard, and that's really kind of tough because nature does lots of different things. But if you think of nature as a standard in terms of the way the building worked, the Porter School, the new building, uses convective cooling. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's aimed to the south. That's kind of interesting. So using what actually is very easy and very cheap to do, and it's there. Accounting for all costs. I want to come back to that point because this gets into college economics and so forth. But those are the standards. This is a process. We pulled together, or we just opened the doors in the design process and said to students, come on in if you'd like to be part of a design of a building. Now, students, all of you under 40, actually all of you under 150, have been watching the world come undone. That is what's happening. Pay attention to species extinction, climate change, ocean acidification, all of the numbers that describe the vital signs of Earth. They're not good. And so we're watching the world come undone, and the question then is, what is the role of architecture and building in raising morale, in creating competence in the making of things, and in the habits of making them together? Is that clear? So we wanted to use a building as a pedagogical or teaching device. By the way, pedagogy sounds, in English at least, a lot like a foot disease. Do you have pedagogy? And well, yeah, I do, but I'm taking something for it. So anyway, it's just educational. So we started out, and the guy here who's this is John Lyle, and John Tillman Lyle was a great architect, landscape architect in California. He died prematurely at age 63 of cancer in 1998, but he helped to facilitate the workshops. And he was the kind of guy that could, when a lot of people walk in a room and they can establish they're smart. When John walked in a room, he made the room smarter. That's a facilitator. So he began to pull ideas out of the students. And the ideas, or some of them are here. This is kind of the building program. And they wanted a zero discharge building. The students thought about that for a while and said they wanted a building which drinking water came in, drinking water went out. And we used to joke that meant that, well, we got to put the toilets in another building then. And then he wanted a building powered by sunshine. Well, I'm in cloudy Ohio. We don't get days like this in Ohio. So they wanted it efficient, but also powered by sunshine. And so that was a pretty tough standard. We had to ask them again and again, do you know where you're from? This is Ohio. We don't get sunshine here. The sunshine in Ohio is a theory that hasn't been proved yet. So these are some of the things that have been talked about. All of you architects have seen this for a long time, products of service and so forth. Can you make buildings that learn and adapt and evolve and so forth? Well, these are the things that were tossed out. Now, this was not all high-level dialogue. The students wanted a pond on site, and they were told they couldn't have a pond. And the reason that they were told by the administration that we couldn't have a pond was that they would skinny dip in the pond. They would take all their clothes off and jump in naked in the pond. And so late one afternoon, one of the students, when the administrators said that, the students said, well, if that's your fear, our nightmare is that administrators would skinny dip in the pond. This was not all high-level stuff about green design and saving the world and all this kind of thing. It finally came down that we got a letter from the college attorney that said, yes, you can have your pond. After I had told them we really wanted a pond, and to keep people out of it, we would stock it with piranha and little fish that eat people. And the attorney sent back a letter saying, okay, or you can tell the kids you can have your pond, but it is not because piranha deter people from going in the pond, it's because they destroy the evidence on which lawsuits are based. We have a pond. The building standards were these. And this, again, came out of, how do I go backwards here? Is that the right side here? Let's see. Well, that is so clever. I'm still learning all about technology. It's not going real well. Anyway, the first standard was no ugliness, human or ecological, somewhere else, some later time. And you think about this, and I've said this several times during the last 2 days. That puts you upstream at wells, mines, forests, and manufacturing establishments where materials start, and downstream where impacts are felt, climate change, toxification, and so forth. The typical young person in the States, and I don't know what the body burden here in Israel would be, but the typical young person carries a body burden of 230 organochlorine compounds that don't belong there. That's just pollution. It's in their fatty tissues and bloodstream. And so you think about this macroscopic design aesthetic, and if the building looks great, but it's caused ugliness, human or ecological, upstream or downstream, you really can't say that it's a good building. Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, that like any standard, like truth, like telling somebody to be absolutely truthful and wonderful and fair and decent, it's a standard we never meet. We're human. We can try to meet it, and we ought to try to meet it. We ought to try real hard to meet it, but we don't quite get there. Buildings are going to be just buildings. They're going to do damage in the world. And so the point of this is to minimize that damage as much as possible. And then secondly here, to use building to create confidence in the creation. Somehow they have to make us smarter and better. And then the last item here, analytical competence. I'll come back to that later. But what should a building be talking about? And one of the things I like about the pod at your new building is that it's going to communicate data. It's going to be wired to collect data and then communicate that to 350,000 people or cars, going by on the road outside. The difference here, very quickly, the difference in green design and I think normal design is the scope of it, and I'll explain that. The integration of the design process, and architects, said a couple of times in the last day or two, are the best integrators I know. If you want a systems thinker, you better get an architect to teach you. So they have got to talk the language of engineering and landscape and materials and water and all this other stuff. Then they have to talk to clients, and that can be the real hard part. And then architecture is always a kind of pedagogy. It's always going to be instructional. And the question is only how it's instructional. But it can't avoid being instructional. Every room, every building, every landscape tells a story. And the fact that we sometimes don't think there's a story to be told itself is a story. It tells you there was no story worth telling in this. The materials come from some place. Where? They have some effects. What are they? So buildings ought to tell stories, and it ought to be legible in many ways. So as buildings emerge, they ought to be making it smarter and so forth. Building landscape or curriculum, I'll explain what we've done on that. And then buildings that learn. Stuart Brand years ago wrote a book called I think it was just called Buildings That Learn, or something very close to that. Pardon? How Buildings Learn. Okay. It's still worth reading. It's probably 20, 25 years old now, but it's still worth reading. And the question then for technologists and for engineers is, can you make buildings where the parts are modular and you can take them off? Now, in your new building, you're going to do that with energy systems. It's really cool. But think of buildings where, as the R factor of the building I'm going to show you in the glazing was or is about R8, but state of the art now is more like R14 to 18. And so if there was a simple way to pop out glazing and put in new so you could upgrade the glazing, that's not, at least I don't think it is possible yet, but it'd be an awfully good idea. The problem is wind shear and the stresses on buildings. This is the building that came out. This is about 14,200 square feet, so it's small relative to the building you built. The technology here was technology available in the late 1990s or mid-1990s. This is a curtain wall. Again, this is our roughly 8 center of glass. And R doesn't translate into your standard, does it?
R value is the same.
It is, all right.
R value is the same.
Center of glass here, and this is triple pane argon gas filled, not krypton, but this is the wastewater treatment facility. And this is just you'll see one other picture of this. It's just simply looks like a tropical greenhouse, but it's a sewage treatment plant. The landscape here, this is the south side. This is the plaza named for John Lyle. This is a landscape that was contoured and planted to replicate the landscape that had been here prior to European settlement. This is the back of it. This is one photovoltaic array. This is 60 kW. This is an orchard here, the back of the auditorium. Out here to the right is a garden area and then a geothermal well field. That is a monologue. That is our town square. Everything in that square exists by human permission. And so there's a monologue. It's humans talking to nature and forcing nature to do certain kinds of things. This is all mowed. This is maintained with a fair, sizable expenditure of fossil fuels and petrochemicals. That is a dialogue, and it looks like a weedy patch. So if you really are kind of anal about this, that's a mess, and the other looks good. If you're ecological about it, it's the reverse. You follow what I'm saying? So landscapes that can learn or teach us, and so you ask, what does the place want to be? So we went into this part of the building, and we took out everything that was non-native. Put back in native plants from a bog nearby that was 10,000 years old. As the glaciers retreated from Ohio, they're reforming this winter, but as they were retreating, by the way, the word glacial, which meant really, really slow, no longer means really, really slow. If you follow the way glaciers are retreating rapidly, it's now kind of a high-speed process. Anyway, that's another matter. But we came back in and we planted this with all native plants and vegetation and so forth. That's a dialogue. And so what happens, there's always kind of a surprise. What happens to that city park in the middle is never a surprise. It always looks exactly like it looks. This is subject to nature, natural cycles and so forth. This is the back of the building. This is a student-maintained garden and orchard. A little bit different view of the same spot. This is the atrium. There is a water fountain here. This is Bill McKibben, the American writer, holding forth on Earth Day a couple of years ago. What he could not see, I was up in the second floor taking a picture looking down. This is a 6-inch rain going on out here. Students from this dorm over here were frolicking here in the pond naked. They were actually in the pond naked. I was looking to see if administrators were joining them. I could not tell. There were some people that were. Anyway, this is the wastewater treatment system. Looks like a tropical greenhouse. It's operated extremely well for 13 years. These are tanks roughly my arm width wide and 7 feet deep. And then across the top of the plant there are rails on which the plants are grounded. And then the goal is to maximize the exposure of the root surface going down in the water column. And plants do what plants do. They take out phosphorus and nitrogen and so forth. All the wood in the building is from certified sources. The fabric here is from, it's a McDonough-Brongart company, so that the fabrics are, as they say, edible. But there are no toxics in it. The typical theater seat, I'm told, has 40 chemicals that off-gas all kinds of bad things. And how are you feeling? You doing all right out there? This is a PV array. This, again, is a 60 PV array. I took this picture. I waited for the sun to get just right and get the angle from the sun here just right. I was standing on a ladder at the edge of this, and I was waiting. It took me 15 minutes on this ladder waiting for the thing just to get right. And I found this picture, my picture, on the outside of Harvey beer bottles in central UK. They took my picture and they put it on their beer, and they didn't tell me about it. So my people are talking to their people. Does that translate? You don't drink beer in Israel, I know that. This is a 100 kW array. This is our senator in the state from the state of Ohio, Sherrod Brown. This is a 100 kW array, and the building performance is like this. Now, this is a kind of interesting issue. Do you remember typewriters? You young people never remember a typewriter. No, you don't remember it. Little keys and had a ribbon, and you type things, and then there's a notebook computer. Now, both turn out sheets of paper with symbols on it, all right? But this one requires occasional drop of oil and a ribbon change. This one requires software changes. But they both do the same thing. Well, the same distinction holds with buildings. If you build a conventional building, it's maintained one way. Build a smart building, like you're doing, and it's going to be maintained a different way. You got to pay attention. You got to do continuous commissioning. You have to pay attention to the electronics and all kinds of other things related to that. So here's the story of the Lewis Center. The red here is building energy consumption. So you see, we didn't come out of the starting blocks real well. The yellow is solar production, and then the net energy is in the gray. So net energy down here, we had some problems with the building here, and then all of a sudden it gets really good. So this year we generated about 150% of the energy of the building needed. This year was 144%. This year in 2014 it's likely to go back over 150%. The difference was building management. Very simply. We hired an engineer, young guy who understood the systems and so forth. He came in here. Now, we're doing pretty well. We're still at around 90% on average across those years and so forth. So we were doing all right as buildings go, but nowhere near what the building could do. The difference was, and the engineer came into my office and he said, you know what's wrong with the building? I said, well, a lot of things. Tell me. He said, well, there are 3 valves that are shut. It took about 35 minutes to open those 3 valves. He had all this pumping energy, forcing fluids up against closed valves. So it just drove our energy costs crazy. So the point here is simply that you do a high-performance building, then you have to manage it differently. This isn't a typewriter. This is a notebook computer. It's a whole different animal. This is, we had in the making of the building, we wanted to monitor the building. This is nowhere near the size and scale of what you're going to do here. But this is a data monitoring system that came out of a class that we had in 2001. We brought in a federal laboratory, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and they taught a class with us, and the questions to the students in the class was, what do you monitor, how do you monitor the building, and why do you do it? And the why was simple. It's quick data. All of you who are parents know that if a kid does something, your kid does something you don't like, and the punishment is 30 days later, it doesn't have any effect. Well, what was that for, Dad? But if your energy bill, you turn on a bunch of lights and you do all this stuff with energy, and then your bill arrives 30 days later, the effect is about the same. And so quick feedback. It's the essence of parenting. It's the essence of good economics. And so real-time data, you get the feedback coming back in. So that's the why in this. Plus, it's interesting. And you begin to acquaint people with how this building fits in the larger context of the world around it. So this is a... and then the 3 of the kids in that class went on to start a company called Lucid Design. It's located out in San Francisco Bay Area now. And they've gone big time. I'm very nice to them because I want them to give money back to Oberlin College, but that's a different thing. But that was a joke, actually. Actually, that's not a joke. But anyway, they become a big deal. And what we've done is this data, you can't see it really, but if you click on this, all the buildings on the Oberlin campus show up. And then you can see their energy use in real time. Energy use, water use, and so forth. So we monitor everything. The kids that did this claimed that it was such a sensitive system, they could monitor faculty brainwave activity in their office. But what do they know? Design rules are these. You front load the design process. This is old hat to all of you. But it means to the client, spend money up front to get the building integrated right. It saves you money in the long term. Optimize the whole system, not the components of a system. Integrate the design team, but you already know that. Incentivize the savings, and then this is irrelevant to this. in the cost of the Lewis Center. Now this goes back to about a dozen years. What we found out was that a client that looked at the cost of a building, like going through a supermarket or whatever, what you pay at the checkout counter is not what you pay. That's just what you bought initially. So there are all these other things. There are design and construction costs, there are life cycle costs, there are external costs to environment and society and so forth. So these do not get included in the cost of the building. And then the hard thing, but you can figure those out. You can monetize those. But if these are hard, in the word, I hope this translates right, but monetize, but put a number on certain things. The fact that it's hard to monetize doesn't make it any less real. It just means it's hard to monetize. Now, all the other things that you get from doing buildings right, all the publicity, all the collateral benefits, those are really difficult to monetize and put a number on, but they also are no less real because they're hard to monetize. You get what I'm saying? So typically the clients, and I've been trying to work with college trustees and so forth to educate them, turn architects and engineers loose. I mean lavishly, but let them do good buildings, high performance buildings. It's important to do because of costs and so forth. It's also the right thing to do. And the collateral benefits for the Lewis Center were, we were in Time Magazine, New York Times, we were on at least 300 or 400 TV programs. About 1,000 pieces of publicity came in. Now that was a long time ago, and that would not be applicable now. But the educational opportunities of this system, what we did was to create a laboratory. Now going back to the first of this talk, climate destabilization. In environmental studies, I have a lab, and my faculty have a lab, that includes food production, water purification, solar design, building monitoring, high-tech monitoring systems, and lots of other things connected with that. So that little acre-and-a-quarter site became a curriculum for us. We studied lots of other things, but we built the curriculum into the landscape and into the building itself. This is just the way the cost curves look, and that's not worth going into right now. This is the rest of the story. And there are two parts to it. We passed, based on the Lewis Center, we passed a college standard that included purchasing, investment, and so forth, and this is an ongoing battle. And the last thing we did here was the Oberlin project, and I want to explain that. This is my city of Oberlin. It was founded in 1832 in a swamp by a bunch of religious do-gooders, and they still sort of hang out. We were, as a college, the first to accept African Americans and women and graduate them. That's part of our DNA at the very beginning. We graduated women before anybody else in the United States did, and African Americans. But we're in the Rust Belt, and you'll see this in just a moment. We are dead center in the middle of the Rust Belt. We have a poverty level here at 28%. Of our residents are below the poverty level. So with the pictures you're going to see, some in the town, it looks like a cool little Midwestern USA town, but it conceals a lot. This is the downtown, very typical pictures of downtown. That's the old school. This is kids on the main street, and this is kind of a typical Main Street scene. Small town America. This is called the Chalk Walk, and they do art on the sidewalks. We pulled together in the Oberlin project the city of Oberlin and Oberlin College in a joint effort. And we had 5 goals initially. We have a bunch of sub-goals, but I'll not mention those. The first thing is, and you'll see a little bit more on this in just a moment, a 13-acre block that the college owns. We're calling this the Green Arts District. You'll see why in just a moment. We want to hit this at the USGBC Platinum level for neighborhood development. That's the ND up here. And economic revitalization. We want this to be the driver in this economy with a little 28% poverty level. So what else can architecture do? Maybe buildings can be drivers in the economic fabric of the society. Number 2, we are we're part of the Clinton Climate Initiative. Bill Clinton found out what we were doing and wanted us to join the Clinton Climate Initiative. So we're one of 3 sites in the U.S., one of 17 worldwide, one of 4 to reach what's called participant status. We've now been rolled into the C40 cities, and C40 cities has Beijing up here and Chicago, and then there's an asterisk about 5 feet below the surface of the earth that says Oberlin, a little town of 10,000 people. So we don't, anyway, never mind. We want to grow 70% of our food locally, so we're working on a greenbelt development. We put together a consortium of educational institutions around this, and then the last item I'll get to in just a moment. These are how the economic development and our goals fit together. We want these to be reinforcing. You'll see why in just a moment. so that as we do economic development in the poorest part of the city, we want that to spill into other kinds of things. So we want to do policy not as a series of one-off silos, but as a series of things that interact. And the goal here is that 2 plus 2, which ought to be 4, becomes 22. 2 plus 2 is 22, not 4. That's where synergy and that kind of interactivity become important. We've organized the community around what we call full spectrum sustainability, just another way to say the same thing. It's just a fancy way to say you're going to have lunch with lots of different people. Now, all of you architects in the room know exactly what full spectrum design is, because you have to do it. You have to talk the language of engineers and economists and landscape people, materials people, and so forth and so on. But now if you apply that same idea to the way we do the public business, that's full spectrum sustainability. You follow what I'm saying? We do these things as a series of one-off kind of projects. So if we want to hit our 70% local food goal, think about that. You better have educators at the table, because kids come out of college now knowing nothing about farming. That was 5 generations ago. Farming in our part of the world is expensive, and so you better have a banker or two there. If you buy a small farm, that starts at $500,000, $500,000, and that doesn't buy you much. You better have a marketer there, because if you grow it and can't sell it, what's the point? And so you begin to see how to do one thing that sounds fairly simple, you have to put a lot of things together. Full spectrum sustainability. Am I running short of time here? You doing okay? Now this is Donella Meadows. If you Google Donella Meadows, an essay called Leverage Points, what comes up is one of the most striking essays I've ever read. And what she's asking in this is, where do you intervene in systems to cause change? And it doesn't matter what the system is. It could be a corporation, it could be a college, it could be a university, it could be anything. But where do we as citizens intervene in various things to cause the right kind of change? So what she does here, and we got her essay, we passed it out to everybody in the community that was part of this. So we passed it out to about 300 or 400 people, and then we held discussions about it. Now she said, this is the least effective stuff, but this is the stuff that we argue about. Down here, when you change the goals of the system, and some of you here in the front are not going to be able to see this, but down at the bottom, the most effective things are when you change worldviews and mindsets. Now, up here, we argue about the coefficients of change. Down here, we argue about the structure of the system. And so all of you, we're up against a lot of structural barriers. And we can slow the rate of change, but we don't do much with that. That just slows the rate. It's like walking north on a southbound train. It doesn't get you where you want to go. It just slows the rate. But anyway, now what we try to get people to think about is this is not scriptural. It's not intended to be. This is the start of a dialogue. And if you change the issue, this would be different in Israel than it is in Ohio. It would be different on particular issues at particular times than it would be at other times on other issues. But we want to get people thinking about, where do you intervene in systems to change them? Now I'm going to go through the next couple slides real quickly. This is the heart of the Oberlin project. This is the driver in the downtown. It's a green arts district. This is what it looks like. This is one of the great art museums in American higher education. That's the Allen Art Museum. If you know American architecture, this was a Cass Gilbert building. He's the guy who designed the Supreme Court and Flatiron Building and the Woolworth Building in New York and so forth. That's a 1917 building. This has been completed at the LEED gold level, which is an amazing accomplishment because this is an old building. It's got all this artwork in it. This art museum ranks behind only those at Harvard and Yale on American college campuses. So this is a major asset. The center building is a performing arts center. Does amazing kind of stuff. We want to expand this. This is the hotel, and when I've said here once before that when I said with my boss present in the front row that hotel was so bad, it was a plausible excuse for limited nuclear war. He said, don't ever say that ever again, so I don't say that anymore. But it was built to the aesthetic standards of interstate motels back in the States. And if you've been in the States and stayed in an interstate motel, you don't ever want to do it again. Anyway, that's the block. This is 13 acres. This is the town square. They're both 13 acres. Everything, when surveyors came across the United States, they surveyed everything into blocks and squares of 640 acres. So this is 13 acres. All this is owned by the college. These two houses will stay. This goes, all this will be reprogrammed for housing and economic development. This is kind of a new site plan. And this is the hotel, you'll see just a second. Now, I want to make a point here, and I'll do it very quickly. I have a granddaughter who's 12, and sometimes she sits in the audience when I lecture, and she asked me where I was going. She says, well, honey, I'm going to go to Israel. I said, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to give a talk in Israel. And she's very earnest. She said, well, Granddad, don't be boring. So I cut her out of our will. She's not getting a dime, and that's about all she would have gotten anyway. But anyway, think about the dialogue about sustainability. Here we are in the 20th century. Martin Rees, the astronomer royal in Cambridge, England, says that our odds as a civilization of making it intact to the year 2100 are 50-50. Get that? We're not talking about, Israel, the United States. We're talking about the whole global civilization, 50-50. Now, you wouldn't get in a car if you're not suicidal. You wouldn't get into a car if you knew that the odds of a fatal accident in the car you were about to ride in were 50-50. You wouldn't do it. But this is the whole planet, and it's for all time. He said after he published that book, Our Final Hour, his scientific buddies wrote him and told him he was way too optimistic at 50-50. All right, now, the point of this is this. We need a big conversation. It's all on the line. So how do we have that large conversation? And so how do we include both halves of the mind? The part of us that's wild and crazy and creative and so forth, typically taken to be the feminine side of the mind, and the analytical, cold reasoning side, typically taken to be the male side of the mind. How do we begin to combine this? This is a jazz building on our campus. We have one of the great conservatories of music in the world. This is the art museum. This is the art museum that's been remodeled or redone, I told you about. We turn out more young people that go on for PhDs in the sciences than any other small liberal arts college in the States. This is a performing arts center. Now, these are assets right close by. Can we bundle these into a big conversation about the human condition? Have art, music, poetry, all these kinds of things. No, by the way, the hotel is powered by sunshine, the food's grown locally. So can we begin to model the kind of world we want to create? And it begins with architecture and design. This is the worst hotel ever built. This is what we want to replace it with. So these are the elements of this, or some of the elements of this block, and we want to do this at the platinum scale, platinum level. This is an artist rendition of what it would look like. This sits right on a corner. This is the Hotel Park Commercial District and a conference facility here and some office space here. Interior view of what it might look like. Exterior view at the back of the building. The energy performance of the building, we believe, can be better than 99% of the commercial buildings built in the States. And it will be entirely solar powered. And we will take some of the difference between the building as it would perform as a silver rated building and the as-built building. The delta, or the difference between those two numbers, will be plowed back into a savings account. That's a hotel footprint. This is what it looks like at street side. This is an existing building, but this is, now, the conference center, this space we want to be part, it is a college-owned building. We want this to be part of a big dialogue. What should we be talking about at this point in human life? 22,000 nuclear weapons on the planet, some unregulated and controlled, climate change coming at us, species extinction, and so forth. You know all the bad news. Now, how do we turn this around? How do we turn that vortex of bad news into something that's good news? I'll skip over these, and I'll skip over this, and that's, this is worth saying a word about. This is right across the street from the hotel. This is a project, $17 million project that was started by 3 former students of mine. It's a heroic story. I won't say any more about it than Josh, Naomi, and Ben stayed in town, raised, begged, borrowed, and got $17 million and built this at the gold level. This is 33 condominiums and street-level commercial space. Apollo Theater, we've remodeled that, redone that. We're starting a housing initiative. This is one of 3 houses. We're forming a company to build low-cost, high-performance housing. Remember that 28% poverty level, so we want to get We want to start a company that hires local people, but we also want houses that are carbon neutral. This is a 3 megawatt solar array we deployed 2 years ago. It's 11 acres of solar systems. We're part of the Clinton Climate Initiative. This is a farm we started toward that 70% local foods goal. This is what we've done so far. Everything in black has been completed. Everything in red is yet to be done. This is going to come in at the $35 million level. These are things already in motion. So we've spent something around 106 million US dollars on this. Most of that's private investment. We've got another roughly 100 million to go. Now, the goal of this is this, and I hope this translates all right. At the end of the day, we want to create a model of what sustainability means, what it is. And the best way to describe that is a story. You may have heard this, but a little girl is drawing a picture, and her mother comes by and says, "Well, honey, what are you drawing?" And the little girl looks up, it reminds me of my granddaughter, looks up at her and says, "Well, Mama, I'm drawing a picture of God." And her mama looks down with pity and says, "Honey, nobody knows what God looks like." And the little girl looks back at her mama very fiercely and says, "Well, they will now." I like that, the chutzpah behind it, but also I want to create, we're 70% of our visual, or probably our sensory apparatus is our eyes. That's why architecture is so powerful as a pedagogical tool, as an instructor, where we want to do and how we make the human presence in the world. So I want to create that model of what sustainability is like. I want to show people, visual people, what it can be like. It doesn't have to be bad. It will be bad only if we wait too long and don't have the imagination and the commitment to make something better. So what's the Oberlin project? Well, it's an extension of the Lewis Center. You saw that. For young people, it's going to be a cool 24/7 downtown. Faculty, better facilities. For the business community, it's more business. For Sherrod Brown and people in the U.S. government, it's a model of economic development in the heart of the U.S. Rust Belt. For Bill Clinton, it's climate action. We think we can be the first coal-fired community to get to carbon neutrality or carbon positivity, a word I don't like. For me, it's an educational laboratory. It's a place where I can take my students, mix them with some of the brightest people I know, architects, engineers, urban planners, and so forth. They walk out of that experience with a face connected with courage, creativity, and some level of genius. I like that. That's real education. So it's not classroom education. I mean, that's very important. It's also being exposed to people who know how to do things and have the courage and commitment to do it. It's a model for the design team of ecological design, full spectrum, because this includes agriculture, economic development, policy, law, all these things all rolled into one. It's also part of national security, and we'll get into those reasons right now. This is where we are. Detroit's here, 83 miles to Oberlin. Cleveland's over here, 35 miles away. Youngstown is over right about here, another hour or so. Can you see Youngstown right there? And then Toledo is right here. That's the heart of the U.S. Rust Belt. Youngstown, Ohio, in 1940 was the highest per capita income in the United States. It now looks like the German army came through and destroyed it, and it's just been left to rot. I mean, almost seriously. So we're putting together a project that starts Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Toledo, Oberlin, Cleveland, and Youngstown. We're calling this the Lake Erie Crescent, and the goal is to take the Oberlin project, this little bench lab size experiment, upscale that to the region, and then begin to whittle this down to the region. So we're pulling together 5 major universities, 2 major foundations, some help from the federal government in Washington in terms of personnel, not cash. And we want to redirect the buying power of those 5 universities to 3 things: smart growth or urban renewal, renewable energy, and sustainable agriculture. And we want to do that in a way that 2 plus 2 is 22, not 4. So we're looking at a very different pattern of development. If you know urban planning literature, the name Jane Jacobs will be no mystery. This is Jane Jacobs, her strategy of import substitution. So what's the world like? Well, it can be hell unless we do something different. And I think it is possible. It's just possible if we act in time. This world is worth fighting for. It's a world of green cities and green neighborhoods and bike trails and kids playing soccer out in the fields and clean water. It can be a world of sustainability. That's what we can, that's what's at stake. And then It can be secure, I think, in a way that we haven't thought about security. It's security from the bottom up. It starts with neighborhoods and a capacity to actually do things by competent, informed, committed citizens. Then I want to close with this slide. This is one of the great state speeches given by Martin Luther King just the year before he was killed. And this is in a speech called A Fierce Urgency of Now. I recommend you to read it if you would like. He says, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of man doesn't remain at the flood. It ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. We can't be too late. Thanks for your time and thanks for being on time. We're not going to be too late. Thank you.